Good evening. As voted by you, my locals members, this is the study for the Thursday night review. Zero air pollution and zero carbon from all energy at low cost, without blackouts in variable weather throughout the US, with 100% wind, water, solar, and storage. It is the Thursday night study review, and you picked a doozy of one. Let's go. So, this is the article. First off, some housekeeping notes. Next week, I will not be producing any content. I'm going to be traveling next week, so I will not be able to produce any content because I'm going to be away from the computer for this. So, there will be that, but I will return the following week, which is the last week of March, with some fresh stuff, of course. As always, of course, for those of you who are locals, members, and supporters, keep an eye out because, of course, when I am recording, there will be a poll the week prior with 4 taglines. Those 4 taglines are tied to 4 articles, and based on your vote, you get to pick which article I am going to review for your pleasure here. And you picked a doozy this week. This one came out a little while ago. It is published in December 2021 was when it was first available online. There was a lot of news about it, so it was officially published in print in 2022. So that's actually the print date of publication, so it's earlier this year. And it is quite a doozy of an article to read, actually. And the reason I say that is y'all can't see the page count the way this is set up, but this thing in its total sum is actually 94 pages, which is insanely long for for a journal article. And the reason why it's 94 pages in the PDF that I have is actually because it includes not just the main article that appeared prominently in the journal itself, but they did so much work for this study that they had a tremendous amount of supplemental material. It is not abnormal to see a supplement, and indeed it's okay. The general kind of rule with having a supplement for something in a journal article is basically like it's stuff that a really interested reader would want to know about, but it's not stuff that is critical to telling the story in the article. With the amount of times they referred to the supplemental, I think some of that wasn't necessarily met as a criterion to keep it in the supplemental, so some of it I do think they should have brought back in, but that's kind of my kind of preference versus editor's preference versus authors and the arguments that they had back and forth in peer review and kind of thing, because this is, generally speaking, this is a research article, but it is tremendous amount of depth, and so to keep this under an hour, I can't go into absolutely everything that's in here for the video here on YouTube. But again, of course, don't forget 8 p.m. Central Time. If you're a member, if you're a supporter on my locals, you get access to the live stream after the premiere on YouTube on Thursday, in which I will be happy to share more depth with those of you who are interested and pull up the full PDF, and we can go scrolling down and looking through all the different chunks and sections that are of importance. So that's that here. Let us get right into it because there are some interesting things. And I will say this is a massive study, and I can imagine the amount of work that the authors put into this is tremendous. Actually, with the amount of stuff that they did here, so it's very, very tremendous. And I only have printed out the main portion of the article. I did not print off all the supplemental material here, but that's for another day. So let's see. First off, the abstract, per usual. This study analyzes 2050 to 2051 grid stability in the 50 states and in the 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia after their all-sector electricity, transportation, buildings, industry, energy is transitioned to 100% clean, renewable wind, water, solar, WWS, electricity, and heat plus storage and demand response, thus to zero air pollution and zero carbon. Grid stability is analyzed in 5 regions, 6 isolated states: Texas, California, New York, Florida, Alaska, and Hawaii. Texas interconnected with the Midwest and the contiguous U.S. No blackouts occur, including during summer in California or winter in Texas. No batteries with over 4-hour storage are needed. Concatenating 4-hour batteries provides long-duration storage. Whereas transitioning more than doubles electricity use, it reduces total end-use energy demand by 57% versus business as usual, BAU. contributing to 63, 43 to 79%, and 86, 77 to 90% lower annual private social private plus health plus climate energy costs, respectively, than the business as usual case. Cost per unit energy in California, New York, and Texas are 11%, 21%, and 27% lower, respectively, and in Florida are 1.5% higher when these states are interconnected regionally rather than islanded. Transitioning may create 4.7 million permanent jobs. 4.7 more million permanent jobs than lost, and requires only 0.29% and 0.55% of new U.S. land for footprint and spacing, respectively, less than 1.3% occupied by the fossil fuel industry today. Okay, so there's a lot of bold claims in there. And what I'm going to show you with this is one of the things that I think is fair to look at. I know that a number of you in my audience probably are not huge fans of modeling and the amount of modeling that's done, but that is essentially a lot of what was done in this study is a tremendous amount of modeling. Why? Because they're talking about 2050, right? They're talking about 28 years from now. Sorry, I was doing the fast math in my head. They're talking about 28 years from now. So you have to get into doing some amount of modeling with this in terms of, if you're going this way versus you're going this way, there's a certain amount of what ifs in here. And in a way, this is a bit of a giant what ifs for them that they are modeling. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just calling it as I see it. And so we're going to get into that. But I also want to make a point here because the modeling kinds of things are all well and good, but I always wonder, because you're talking about a model, and particularly when you're chaining models together, as we're going to see, how do these uncertainties thusly track through the chain of models? Because it is a model, there's certain amount of uncertainty associated with it, statistically speaking, and you can't utterly ignore that. So, which, to their credit, I will say that up front, to their credit, they didn't ignore it entirely. I'm still left with some questions and some queries, so let's get into that. Let's see. The United States is currently undergoing a slow but consistent transition to clean renewable energy. We'll get into that in a second. We call energy sources that meet these criteria wind, water, solar sources, including onshore and offshore wind turbines, the wind section, tidal turbines, wave devices, geothermal electric power plants, hydroelectric power plants for the water side, rooftop utility solar photovoltaics, so your solar panels, and concentrated solar power plants, solar. WWS heat generating technologies include solar thermal and geothermal heat plants. WWS electricity must be transported by alternating current, high voltage, alternating currents, and high voltage direct current. WWS energy must also be stored in either electricity, heat, cold, or hydrogen storage media. Finally, a transition to WWS requires equipment for transportation, industry, and building that runs on electricity. Such equipment includes electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, heat pumps, induction cooktops, arc furnaces, resistance furnaces, lawn mowers, leaf blowers, chainsaws, and more. There's a lot of stuff that we're talking about that they're talking about transitioning here, when they mean literally everything. Transitioning to transitioning to wind, water, solar. Here, which I will agree with their thing of WWS, because usually when we're talking about renewables, we're just talking about wind and solar, but they're including water and geothermal in this too, which is quite a bit more than just the traditional renewables. So we'll make a point there. For this study, we consider only WWS energy, since we believe that WWS technologies result in greater simultaneous reductions in air pollution, climate damage, and energy insecurity than do non-WWS technology. We do not include fossil energy, bioenergy, non-hydrogen synthetic fuels, blue hydrogen, carbon capture, direct air capture, or nuclear energy, since each may result in a greater risk of air pollution, climate change, and/or energy insecurity. The trick of getting there, though, with that transition, is you're probably going to need some of those for a while. And actually, nuclear, I think, is actually a fair bit more climate friendly, if you will, than others. So I'm surprised that nuclear is just thrown out in all of this. But such is. Let's see here. So in the next couple of sections, like I said, this is a really long article, so I can't go everything in full detail as I would like this time. In this section here, they're basically going through a lot of background. So what they're talking about here is in 2020, WWS generators, so wind, water, solar, produced 19.2% of US electricity, which is an increase from 17% in 2019. So, yes, this is something that is slowly becoming more of the US energy grid as a whole. So you do have that. That is the way it's going, and particularly from wind power, followed by water. Solar is less so. Renewable. What they're talking about here is a particular thing in different policy making that's kind of resulted in this, and it's the Renewable Portfolio Standard policy, which has been a government issued kind of policy that's followed around, that's kind of pushed everybody in the direction of doing more renewables. Here, including some other laws and things like that, talking about different states phasing out fossil fuels in transportation. Again, I'm not going to go into huge depth of details in the background here. Of course, this will be linked for you, so please feel free to peruse it. And if it's behind a paywall for you, that's where you can just hit me up in my locals, because I will, of course, I will share the PDF. Experts believe the world needs to transition all energy by 2035 to eliminate 7 million air pollution deaths that occur each year and minimize climate damage. Okay, that comes back to the arguments around climate change. I find it remarkably unlikely that you're going to do that, if only because of the leapfrogging argument. So, leapfrogging has been put forward to get developing countries to jump past fossil fuels and go towards the renewables and kinds of things like that. But that has not been proven to work, actually, to get society to do that. There's a very tight coupling in societal evolution with technological evolution, and so it's kind of hard to leapfrog over that kind of thing. So we'll see. The other thing they point out here in the background is one of the concerns and the reasons they did this. On the other hand, some have blamed the growth in renewable electricity and its intermittency for the August 14th, 15th, 2020 summer grid blackout in California and the February 14th through 18th, 2021 winter blackout in Texas. WWS supplied close to 50% of California's electricity and 23% of Texas's electricity in 2020. So, this is a concern that folks have had, and they talk about it here. Nevertheless, a substantial fear is that increasing WWS will increase blackouts. One purpose of the study is to evaluate this contention. Now, I'm going to point out something that's very clear in this here. The thing about the Texas failure in particular is it was not a failure of the power grid. It was an equipment failure around the generation source, which was to say, not just the wind turbines. I'm sorry, it's not just the wind turbines that got screwed up in Texas last year. They're quite right about that. It's also the case of other things getting frozen up and not working as well as they should, connected to natural gas and coal and nuclear stuff as well. So there was a whole crap ton of things that didn't work quite right in Texas last year with that. So sorry, it's not just that. They do have some decent citations in here to point that out. But that was equipment failures. That was not a failure of the power grid. Like, the power grid couldn't maintain the supply to everybody. That's not the issue in that Texas case. And that's not the issue they're talking about here. They get into it later, but they don't actually talk about this in terms of equipment failures. They talk about this as to whether or not the grid can sustainably provide power continuously if you switched it to wind, water, solar from the current mix of energies that we have now. So there's a lot in here, as I said. So yeah, and this is the other point that I want to make, is these authors have been doing this for quite some time. This is the 50-state roadmap that they have, which is, again, why they have like 60, 70 odd pages of supplemental material associated with it, because everything for every single state, I think, is in there, if I remember correctly, from what I read. And it's certainly got a lot there. One of the things they do, actually, is they talk about California and Texas when they recently experienced blackouts. Can they run entirely on WWS storage, energy and storage, both in isolation and when connected to larger grids? And also talk about battery storage, because one of the things that has been holding up renewables is the idea of, well, you need batteries, and you need large scale batteries to be able to hold this energy to do that. So like Tesla's been talking about having batteries in homes for when you get solar panels on your house, you can charge the battery, and so when the power goes out, you can run off the battery and run your house, kind of thing. Or you're feeding power back to the electric grid yourself if you have a solar panel on your house sometimes. And that does happen. I do have a few colleagues I know who have solar panels, and they've talked about it a few times that when it's been a good month, they've actually sent power back out to the electric grid, and the only thing they've been charged with on the bill has been just the connection hookup fee because they haven't taken energy from anybody else. They haven't taken energy off the grid. They've actually supplied it to the grid. So there are benefits to these things. I'm not going to knock that. Okay. So that's the background in brief. Okay. So the methodology is huge, and they have the full methodology listed in the supplemental material. So that is, again, what I would say. If you want to go read this paper, I would go check that in full. But they did summarize it in brief. And this is why I mention this seems to be very much a study that is a chain of models. And it kind of has to be, like I said, because you're talking about projecting to 2050. So it has to be a chain of models. You can't get away from that when you're talking about projecting or predicting the future, if you will. So one of the things they do right out of the gate is they have 2018 data for what the current use is from the Energy Agency, and they project that out to 2050 with each of the 6 fuel types, 4 sectors, and what have you. So that's taking basically historic rates from 2018 and going out to 2050. What would it look like if you kept going with the kind of fuel mixes and things that we have? They'd put in another scenario in there where they have the model figure out, you transition each and every sector over to electricity from wind, water, and solar, and heat load and all that kind of stuff over to those kinds of things, and calculate the changes in energy demand and what have you that are associated with it. That is a lot of a modeling thing that's there. Perform resource analysis to estimate mixes of wind, water, solar, electricity, and heat generators to meet annual average end use load among energy sectors in each state. Okay, so there's that also. Those are things about just, if you have the transition, how would all of these different things change versus if you didn't have the transition? That's a bit of modeling that's straight up front right there. Okay, so use the prognostic global weather, climate, air pollution model, the Gator GCM-MOM, I think, gas, aerosol, transport, radiation, general circulation, mesoscale, and ocean model, which accounts for competition among wind turbines for available kinetic energy to estimate wind and solar radiation fields and heat and cold loads in buildings every 30 seconds for 2 years in each state and DC. So 2050 and 2051 is what they're talking about here. And I'm going to tell you right now, for that kind of timestamp and the amount of stuff that's calculating, that is intensely complicated to do. Here, that kind of modeling world is where I live in when I'm not talking here on YouTube. And so this is intense stuff that we're talking about. For sure. And, it's just, I do think about some of the uncertainties that are associated with it, because this is a model. So you're looking at all the stuff that they were doing before, and now it comes into this particular model. Group the 50 states and DC into regions listed in table 2, then use the load match grid integration model to match time-dependent wind, water, solar supply with demand, storage, and demand response every 30 seconds in 2050 and 2051 for each region. Calculate the differences in BAU and business as usual and wind, water, solar, energy, health, and climate costs. Calculate land areas needed, calculated job change, discuss uncertainties. So that pretty much what goes into the whole thing with the study. So like I said, massive amount here. And I give a lot of credit because they recognize right up the front, there's an awful crap ton of modeling that's involved with this in terms of, how do energy loads behave and what's the weather involved in all of these situations, and how does the grid behave when you're dealing with the weather under these different scenarios that they're testing. So there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into this. I am complimenting on that. in the next sections, I'm just going to point out some of the interesting things that I have, because I do want to get to the end and mention something about the uncertainties, because I don't think for a lot of folks, the modeling world like this is quite a heck of a black box. And so, and I can understand for a lot of people with dealing with the modeling, that because it's a black box, or because, models can be wrong, there's there's the tendency to just say, no, I don't really care about the models because they are, they're wrong, or I don't understand them, or any number of different things that are there. So I do want to talk about some of that with respect to the uncertainties involved in doing a modeling exercise, because it is a common thing, not just to what this is, but there's modeling exercises done in lots of different fields of science. And the reason it's done is because when you get to the point where you're understanding something and you can make some generalizations, or you figured out a relationship between this, and this, then of course the next thing is, you test some of your relationships by attempting to predict what will happen. And often with a computer model, statistical model, numerical physical model, some of the different types of models that they talk about here. It's not an abnormal thing. In fact, matter if you're dealing with weather forecasting, as you guys have probably in your day-to-day life, there's a weather forecast or something like that, there's a model that's somewhere behind that in terms of predicting the weather in your local area. And not just, weather model complemented by expert expertise, that's redundant, expert knowledge, let's put it that way, of what the weather is typically like in the region, because sometimes the model can be wrong in weather forecasting, and that's where the experienced meteorologist who's in an area and has lived in that area can say, no, I don't think that's quite right, and talk about that with the audience. So some simulation results here. Okay. So this particular figure here has to do with the transitioning timeline that they're talking about. And, oh goodness, zoomed in really close, didn't I? So the timeline for 100% wind, water, solar by 2035. This is the first panel. So they tested two different kind of scenarios for this transition. And this black thing is the fossil fuels and what have you, and it basically gets forced down. And the idea here is, one of the things that they're showing is, what kind of sources would come up to be the biggest in their simulation. That's not to say it would happen exactly that way, that X percent of energy in the United States would be provided by this or this or this. That's not to say it would exactly happen that way. This is the model simulation, how they think it would work out here. But one of the other things that they suggest is that in here they suggest that the demand, power demand and supply here is projected here at the end of the century to be 2.72 terawatts, which is a lot. As opposed to transitioning to wind, water, solar, you get to less than half of that. That I have to admit, I don't entirely understand, but where they get to that is they're talking about things that would change over and where demand would be automatically reduced because it's not from fossil fuels anymore, it's switching to some of these other sources. That's my understanding with it. So that's what I point out for you there. Again, I encourage you to go read part of this yourself, because there's so much in here that I just absolutely cannot entirely cover. Let's see. The result of electrifying or providing direct heat for all energy, transitioning from business as usual to wind, water, solar in 2050 decreases all-purpose annual average end use wind, water, solar power demand over the U.S. by 56.7% to 1.818 terawatts. Mean decrease in the U.S. is 37.9 percentage points due to the efficiency of WWS electricity over combustion. This is one of the things, is that wind, water, solar seems to be more efficient at providing energy than the typical business as usual mix from 2018 projected into 2050. Let's see. They talk about the difference here. 22, changing transport over to be wind, water, solar based, so it'll be a lot more electric cars, electric vehicles in general. 5.1 points are due to the efficiency of electricity over combustion for heat. Okay. Some of those kinds of things. So yes, it does reduce here, according to their simulation, mind you, it does reduce um the demand effectively. The power demand in the United States. One of the things, of course, that they note is because, in other words, although wind, water, solar reduces total end use load by 56.7%, it increases the electricity load by 103%. Thus, the overall power needs decrease, but the electric power needs increase. This is not something that should be surprising. You're talking about switching everything to be electric coming off of wind, water, and solar rather than any combustion kind of material. So yeah, totally get that. That one actually makes sense. Let's see here. Indicate that wind and solar dominate future energy production under the 100% WWS scenarios here. 44.6% of all energy supplied may come from wind, and 28% onshore, and 16.4% offshore. So they're thinking wind primarily with a lot of these different things. The other thing that can happen is shedding and losses, and that's something that they talk about right here. I'm not going to go too much into that. Okay, this is a complicated figure, but they have several of these. This is specific for Texas when they were looking at it. And what they're showing here is that over the load changes going all the way along here, and how that's all completely correlated, what have you. What comes from different things before and after losses in the system. But I want to point this out because I'm not entirely sure it got enough treatment here. So this is Texas wind power output right here, correlated with the building heat load. And these are not very strongly correlated. I think if I zoomed in here, you'd probably see it, but the number here for coefficient of variance is 0.123, which is not a tremendously large number. It's not a strong relationship there, and you can kind of see it from the spread of clouds. The spread of dots, rather. So there's the note that I wanted to make with that, is that some of these things in their model, and they're very good about showing this. I'm actually really, really pleased that they show this, because they're literally putting all their cards out on the table. We did all of this. We're showing you all of this. We did this. They did this thing over here. I really appreciate that, because you don't get that often. And this is a bloody complicated study to try and pull this all together. I'm sure they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what's going to go in here versus what's going to go in the supplemental. But it's just important to note out that, some of these things don't really correlate all that well here. And that goes back to my question, how do some of these uncertainties kind of translate? What if you did a little bit more regression work and looked at different components of output and what have you versus building heat load, those kinds of things. Because I think you would get something much more, very much to explain things a fair bit more if it was not simply a linear relationship between wind power and building heat load. I would actually wonder, is there something in here of a polynomial or a logarithmic or anything like that could end up changing this? Because this being what it is, I mean, you could put this on a logarithmic scale and see perhaps something different or not. Random thought, to be honest. Random thought. Let us see. So one of the questions that they asked was whether or not you would need serious long duration batteries. And they define long duration by something that can hold power for 62 hours or more, which is quite a fair bit longer than most other batteries. So what are the hydrogen battery storage capacity needed to keep each region stable? What they basically said here in terms of the batteries is they think that rather than doing a 62-hour-long battery, they think that you can hook up concatenated 4-hour batteries. And this is what they mean by that. All batteries modeled are assumed to have a 4-hour storage at their peak discharge rate. To obtain longer storage, batteries are concatenated in series. In other words, if an 8-hour storage battery is needed, then one 4-hour battery is depleted before a second 4-hour battery is depleted. Minimizing storage time maximizes the flexibility of the batteries, both to meet meet peaks in demand and to store electricity for long periods. For example, suppose 100 batteries, each with a 4-hour storage and a peak discharge rate of 10 kilowatts, are concatenated. This allows for either 400 hours of storage at a peak discharge rate of 10 kilowatts or 4 hours of storage at a peak discharge rate of 1,000 kilowatts, or anything in between. In sum, batteries with longer than 4 hours of storage are not needed to keep the grid stable. So this is talking about the battery problem that I mentioned at the start with renewables and what they consider. They talk about it that this study suggests that long duration, greater than 62 hours storage for a single battery is never needed because we use storage for both its storage capacity and peak discharge rate, and the ratio of storage capacity to peak discharge rate is never greater than 62 hours. So that's a whole thing here. Thus, the greater the interconnectedness of the regions, the less the battery storage is needed. That's the other thing that they're talking about here. One of the assumptions that they make in here is that everything is perfectly interconnected between the different regions, between the different states. The states are not entirely managing just their own energy grid, because that is a thing that is primarily a state function. Is the maintenance and is the maintenance and care and installation of the electric grid. This is why they're talking about Texas here, because Texas is actually very independent from the other states with respect to its electric grid. One of many things. Anyway, let's see. One of the things they talk about here, and I don't think I have time to go through this as fully as I would like. One of the things they're talking about here is they are starting to assign more, not just the cost of trying to put in the infrastructure, but what's the cost in dollars of other things. You have the energy cost, yes, but also what's the cost is associated with health. One of the things that gets tagged with that in terms of fossil fuels is the amount of pollution that's put out has a health cost that people are breathing it in, and therefore, get sick with whatever comes out of the plant if you live in proximity, or the plant doesn't scrub well enough, or what have you. When you're talking about coal-fired plants or natural gas-fired plants, it's the same thing. So that's what they talk about when they mean health costs. And the climate cost, it has to do with what's the CO2 equivalent emissions that they're talking about here. Because you're talking about wind, water, solar, which doesn't emit anything, they argue you can have climate costs be zero because they don't have any emissions of carbon. Here. So automatically, in the logic that they have here, the wind, water, solar becomes better from the climate standpoint. It also becomes better from the health standpoint because you're not outputting pollutants into the atmosphere and what have you that people can come down the line to breathe. So that's what they're arguing in that section 3.3, is they're talking about a lot of that in here, and I don't have too much to add to that. But the energy costs, that is the section I did want to talk about. So let's see. Table 4 indicates that the present value of the upfront capital cost between 2020 and 2050 to transition a well-interconnected CONUS grid plus Alaska and Hawaii, total USA, to wind, water, solar is $8.94 trillion in 2020 dollars. So it's more now with inflation. If the 8 regions making up the 50 states are isolated, the capital cost is $10.95 trillion. If all grid regions are isolated, but Texas and the Midwest are merged to TexMRO, the capital cost of transitioning all 50 states drops to $10.28 trillion. So they're talking about all the infrastructure, all the energy, everything. Cars, what have you. Just make this very abundantly clear. When they say 100% wind, water, solar, that is exactly what they mean. Every single thing that uses energy, from your computer to the internet to cars to lawnmowers to goodness knows what, transition it all off somehow or another, that it is all based on wind, water, solar energy. And this is this is where it gets interesting, because that is a what if. It's something we may eventually get to. Something we may very much eventually get to, but it is a big what if in the meantime. So that's just a point to make there, that's what they're talking about, is the upfront cost to do that kind of transition with the infrastructure and the electrical and what have you. One of the things here that, of course, is then important is you got that cost up front. How much time does it take to pay it back? I don't know whether or not I agree with this based on the modeling. I would love some more details in terms of the modeling that's in here to see whether or not I would agree with it. But this is what they think. The time to pay back the cost of the wind, water, solar system is the capital cost of the system divided by the difference between the business as usual and the wind, water, solar annual private cost or social energy cost. For example, the mean time to pay back the cost of infrastructure for the CONUS, Alaska, and Hawaii simulations due to private energy cost savings from wind, water, solar is 5.7 years. The payback time due to solar energy cost savings is 1.5 years. Thus, the cost of WWS infrastructure is repaid rapidly due to energy, health, and climate cost savings. The amount paid back is through energy sales rather than subsidy. So they're talking about the direct energy sales of the grid, actually, being what is driving that there. And the latter part that I have highlighted in that section actually is about what I was talking about with the deaths and the carbon, so I won't go into that here. And so this is the kind of interesting stuff that we are dealing with this, in terms of they think that anywhere from 9 to 11 trillion, let's say, dollars in upfront costs and infrastructure to convert everything in the United States to wind, water, solar can be paid back within 10 years if we were to do it. That's an interesting question as to whether or not it would, but we shall see. We shall see. So, the footprint kind of thing, that's been one of the other concerns about renewables at large, is that the large fields of solar panels or the large areas with the wind turbines, they do take up a significant amount of space. And that's what we're talking about with concerns with ecosystems and what have you, and development and more people going out into different places and things, that you do have a concern about that. What they're arguing here is that obviously if it's offshore, it doesn't count in the land kind of thing. But what they're arguing is the total land footprint for wind, water, solar is 0.84% of U.S. land. But for comparison, it's 1.3% today used by the fossil fuel industry. The question that I have that they really didn't get answered in that section, actually, is that they didn't talk about whether or not that includes the transmission lines to get from one place to another. Like if you have a large solar farm or a large wind turbine field or hydroelectric plant on a big river, how does that include the transmission lines and all the equipment to get it from where it's generated to where it needs to go to service families and businesses and what have you in different areas? So that's the other kind of question that I have. They do talk about the jobs. I'm not going to go into that one right now. Question arises as to whether the use of 100% wind, water, solar in the United States can avoid blackouts, such as those that occurred on August 14th, 15th, 2020 in California and February 14th to 18th, 2021 in Texas. The Texas blackouts were caused by widespread natural gas, coal, nuclear, and wind turbine equipment failure. The present study does not consider equipment failure caused by extreme weather. That's the point here. Instead, it examines whether the Texas grid can stay stable if all fossil fuel and nuclear power are replaced by wind, water, solar, assuming de-icing equipment is added to the turbines. The simulations here suggest that blackouts in California and Texas can be avoided at low cost in such cases with wind, water, solar. The main reasons are the significant demand reduction due to wind, water, solar, and the ability of wind, water, solar supply plus storage and demand response to meet demand. So in other words, they say yes in there. They say yes. Now, I want to get to the point here because I really do think the authors did a good thing in that they included this whole section just talking about the uncertainties. And I'm very glad that they did that because this was a heck of a chain of models and analysis that they did here. So for one thing, I think if it was a peer review that it didn't include a whole section on the uncertainties involved, I probably, if it were me, I would never let it pass peer review myself. So that's kind of why I talk about some of these things. The fact here that the Texas and California grid stay stable with 100% wind, water, solar does not guarantee stability under all other conditions. Our results may have uncertainties associated with them that create some risk of instability. These are described next. Okay. This is where we want to get into some interesting things that I do have some points with. And it has to do with the uncertainties. Like I said, I'm thrilled they put in this whole section on uncertainties. Overall, I thought this was quite well done. A huge amount of work, but quite well done for what they were working with, acknowledging caveats and all these kinds of things and what have you. I still think you should have included nuclear some of it because I don't necessarily view it as climate unfriendly as others do. But that's me and personal preference more so than me saying anything about how they did the research. Like I said, think it was well done. I think it was well done. Excuse me. It's late. Let's see. This study has many uncertainties. One is the assumption of a perfectly interconnected transmission system in each region. In all cases, perfectly interconnected transmission is assumed, but transmission and distribution costs and losses are accounted for. The fact that stable solutions are found for domains of all sizes indicates that this assumption has no impact on the ability of grids to stay stable, only on the cost of grid stability. That is assuming that everything is perfect. I almost have to say that, I don't think the size matters if it's perfectly connected. It's best way I can say is it almost seems like a non sequitur because if you're assuming everything is perfectly connected in a domain regardless of the size, then yeah, if everything's perfectly interconnected, then it should be stable, right? That would be just what naturally occur to me is if it's perfectly interconnected, yeah, it should stay stable. But it's not perfectly interconnected, you got a glitch or infarction in the system somewhere, then no, it doesn't necessarily stay stable if the size changes. So I don't know. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but I'm not as familiar with the energy side of things and the grid construction and what have you as others, so I'm just literally just asking a question, not necessarily saying anything bad of the article. Okay. Let's see. Another uncertainty. Oh, yes, these two paragraphs did catch my attention. So those of you familiar on the side, well, not on the side, I do deal with a lot of the climate-related world myself on a regular basis. Another uncertainty is whether the time-dependent load and supply data are sufficiently representative of the real world in 2050 and whether they capture extreme weather events. First, the Gator GC-MOM simulations account for the 2050 climate, greenhouse gas, and natural and anthropogenic pollution emissions conditions upon a conversion to WWS. Since the model predicts the weather continuously worldwide, the simulations account statistically for extreme weather events. Third, all wind and solar supplies in Gator GCM-MOM are calculated with the same meteorology as are building heat and cold loads, and all are calculated at a resolution of 30 seconds. A related uncertainty is whether a 2-year simulation is sufficient to account for significant variations in weather and costs of energy. In previous analyses of the U.S. as a whole, grid stability with load match, simulations were run for 6 years, 5 years, and 3 years. Stable grids were found in all cases while accounting for variable and extreme weather. In all cases, like in this case, WWS costs were substantially lower than BAU costs. As such, it seems unlikely that a longer simulation period would make much of a difference in the main conclusions here. Okay. So, what I would ask of that second one, I'm going to take the second one first. What I would ask of the second one right there is, were you just running for 6 years, 3 years, and what have you, but you weren't varying the sequence of weather events that were included in it? And the reason that I ask about that, were you varying the sequence of weather events in it? The reason that I ask about that is that from a climate perspective, 6 years is not representative of the climate at all. And what is the climate? The climate is basically what is the typical weather, the average frequency of extreme events, the average intensity of those extreme events when they occur, at least in terms of statistical distributions, right? And the World Meteorological Organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the whole works there look at 30 years as a minimum to represent the climate. The reason why is because of the natural oscillations that we have in the climate from things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation, multi-decadal oscillations, the Pacific decadal oscillation, the North Atlantic oscillation. All of these kinds of things do affect global and regional temperatures. And in the United States, for sure, in particular parts of the country, El Nino is one big thing that affects temperature and precipitation in different seasons, driving them to be warmer, drier, colder, wetter, any number of different things. Because it's only 6 years, or only 3 years, or only 2 years, I start to wonder in that situation if it was basically selecting, I guess, what were those 2 years, 3 years, 6 years like compared to the larger climate of 30 years we would normally use? Were they close to normal? Were they hot? Were they cold? Were they somewhere mixed in the middle? Which, great, if you got lucky with that, that's great. But that's what I wonder about, is how representative were those 2 years chosen, 6 years chosen of the climate. They could have done that in the other studies. I'm not saying that they didn't do that. I just wonder that from what I'm reading here, because you're not necessarily accounting for that. You're not necessarily accounting for the climate. You're just giving it 2 odd, 3 odd, 6 odd years. And yeah, it may not change anything to do a longer simulation. My only question would be is how representative are those 2 years, 3 years, 6 years that you chose to what would be the typical selection to represent climate of more like 30 years to 50 years. So that would be my kind of question on that one. The other thing here that I would point out is they used the GCM model. So one of the things that comes up with IPCC is the idea of, what is driving the uncertainty in the larger climate projections, right? At different points. And with respect to temperature, at least, when you get to the end of this coming century in the model simulation worlds with some of the statistical breakdowns of it, it's more like the different emission scenarios, the things of human action that really affect the uncertainty. Now, to their credit, they essentially represented that here because they're talking about 2 different ways to go with energy production, and what does that mean? So that's not an issue. What is more concerning to me is using only one climate-related model for this, because I recall correctly from some of the stuff from IPCC and other studies from times past, the biggest source of uncertainty in the climate side in that mid-century time range is the difference between the global models, a scientific uncertainty on exactly what's going to happen when you get out that far. So that's the only thing that would kind of strike me. And yeah, so good on you. I think it's very good to acknowledge that. And that's great that Gator GCMOM maybe is fairly good at calculating all these different things. And to their credit, there may just be not another model like that does the same things that it's after, calculating building and heat loads and what have you on top of everything else. So that's a whole other thing. That's totally fair. But it is a curious question that I would have. If you were to run this with a different model of the climate, atmosphere, what have you, what would you get? Because there are different models out there. There's plenty of them. I think there's like 40 different general circulation models in general global climate models, in the IPCC, if I recall correctly. So that would be just my curiosity, really. That's all. I would be really curious about this, just knowing from what I've read with IPCC stuff lately that would be of interest. Let's see. Further uncertainty is whether the grid will stay stable in the real world, even if the model indicates it will. The model examines only a finite set of conditions. In the real world, many more conditions arise. This could give rise to grid instability. However, we think that real grid planners will build a 100% wind, water, solar grid step by step and put sufficient safeguards in to ensure grid stability by the time 100% wind, water, solar is reached. It's a fair instability. Not instability. It's a fair uncertainty to talk about. You don't know that for sure. Yet another uncertainty is whether the models used here can replicate the real world. And they talk about this here. That's great. I'm glad it's used in a lot of studies and what have you. I'm also kind of concerned about, what's the change that goes on with these different things. If you picked a different model that did just as well in historical period, what would the difference be with that part of the modeling chain? That's why I'm always curious with these kinds of things with modeling studies. Whenever I see them from whatever field, is like if you're chaining one model to another, how does it translate the uncertainties all the way through from the beginning to the end? You know, if you did one thing a little bit different, what's the sensitivity of this thing over here? If all those kinds of things are, generally speaking, because I geek out over statistical related models all the time. Statistical and numerical models are all sorts of fun, that I just like, I'm just curious. That, generally speaking, I'm just curious. It's not a critique against their work, actually, because I'm thrilled that they acknowledged all this. I'm absolutely thrilled that they acknowledged all this. Okay, we are close to the end here, and I will just make my one last point. They come back to this again. Upfront capital cost of 50-state U.S. transition is $8.9 trillion. If well interconnected, $10.95 trillion if you're disconnected, or $10.3 trillion. So this is in 2020 US dollars. Probably has changed a lot, particularly with the inflation in the last year or two. So the thing that concerns me, and the other thing that they acknowledge here is, just because we said all this doesn't mean it can get done, because one of the things they put in right here, actually, I didn't highlight it, but one of the things they put in right here is the political uncertainty that's involved. And that's great. I'm glad that they admitted, we're putting this out there, kind of thing, but it's up to you what you want to do with it. We think you probably should do something to go in that direction, but that's up to you guys. And that's great. Actually, I really appreciate seeing that, because it says something to a certain amount of disinterestedness that is supposed to go with research studies, and talk about the normative principle of disinterestedness on the channel, right? That when you do research, it should be not influenced by the societal narratives, or by your own self-interest outside of the research, kind of thing. With that in mind, there is a note that I did want to make on this, because, let's see, they're talking about the upfront capital to change everything in the United States over to wind, water, solar from what it is currently. $10 trillion. So, as of the time of this recording, and just off screen, you all can't see it, but just off screen, I've got the US debt clock. Right now, we're running at a $30.322 trillion debt as of the time of this recording. And it is, let's see, the debt to GDP ratio is 125%. Almost 126%, actually, as I look at the number. So what we're talking about is, country is already in debt, and we're going to be adding a little bit, well, we're going to be basically adding 44 some odd percent up front. One of the things you can do with the Debt Clock website online is the Debt Clock Time Machine. And that is where it gets kind of scary and concerning for me. If we fast forward to today, as of the time of this recording, in 2026, 4 years from now, when you're talking about another different kind of budget than the one we're on right now, at current spending rates, the estimated debt of the United States is more than $47 trillion, according to the US debt clock. That is scary enough in itself, because as much as there are things that I would actually support, getting over to wind, water, solar. I think that's mostly a good idea. I'm also looking forward to seeing what other technologies come up, because they didn't talk about that here. At the same time, it's probably not going to do well for this country in terms of the amount of debt we have, the amount of debt that we will have, to add another $10+ trillion on top of the national debt to do all this. So there's got to be a different way to pay for it, would be my kind of assessment. This is the non-scientific part. This is just me pointing out something that is about the real world, that while this study is really, really good, you're going to have a hard time selling it when this country is already in a crap ton of debt, as it is. And I suppose one of the things that I would like to see is, if you're going to add that to the debt, and you think you can pay off that thing in here, the transition, in 6 years, or 6 to 10 years, as they talked about in here, then can you go farther and start paying off the rest of the US debt doing this? That's just a speculation on my part that I'd be curious to see. But yeah, I don't know that this is a good idea to necessarily. I think overall, this is a great study. Very in depth, very thorough. Some curiosity questions that I have just based on what I know of the climate modeling world and different climate projections and what have you, how they would handle that. Admittedly, may not be relevant, but just curiosity question, my part. Yeah, I don't know if it's a good idea for the long-term sustainability fiscally of this country to add another 10 trillion on top of what is right now 30 trillion debt, and maybe in the next 4 years creeping up on 50 trillion dollars in debt. Because that can't last forever. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Of course, this will be linked in the description for you. It's quite a long beast of an article, but I hope you go read it because it would be quite fascinating. There's lots of details in there. Don't forget to later at 8 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, local supporters can join the live stream for an exclusive discussion on this particular article and go into more depth here. And that's it for now. If you like the video, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Remember, next week there will be no content because I'm traveling, but that will be it for now. And until next time, I hope you I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, my friends.